So, continuing our march through established material with a little bit of extra added stuff. Um, the fourth chapter in the second section is on evolution, so some of this should sound like review. This is one of those concepts that is kind of it's kind of like taking a foreign language and not knowing what grammar is. Not just not knowing the grammar of the foreign language, but not really understanding how grammar works or what grammar is. Evolution is it's basically the foundation of a tremendous amount of biological thought. So it's worth going through a couple of times. This is a little bit off topic, but it does have evolution in it. It says evolution of intellectual freedom, where before grad school, I'm going to research whatever I want. I remember going in with a plan and then finding out pretty quickly, no, you can't really do that. Is that the resources just don't exist here to be able to do that. And it probably wouldn't work anyway. Then, as a graduate student, I'm going to research whatever my professor wants. I was lucky enough, I had a lot of freedom to pick stuff that was related to what my professor was doing, but I wasn't actually working on his research. His research was pretty limited. Although he did research, amoebas that eat your brain, so that was kind of interesting. Assistant professor, I'm going to research whatever my tenure committee wants. Is that tenure is basically how you get long-term employment. Tenured professor, I'm going to research whatever my grant committee wants. Now you're looking for money. And emeritus professor, after you've retired, I'm going to research whatever and then research in peace, RIP. When the world was a shallow place, and history didn't go back very far because you were depending on what people told people, then there wasn't really any even hint that there were major changes. I mean, people knew there had been like disasters and stuff and, wars and that sort of thing. But in terms of living things, the idea that things changed over time really wasn't recognized. And even when people started to pull fossils out of the ground, the assumption was that these were remnants of animals that still lived somewhere. They just weren't local anymore. Here there be dragons beyond the edges of the map, because they were finding dinosaur bones. And when you find multiple bones or a small articulated skeleton, you're pretty sure it's not just an accident of rock formation. As people started to eventually analyze the fossils, a lot of times they would find recognizable structures compared to animals that lived in their own time, but they were different. Is that you've got all of these extinct elephant forms, but only the modern elephants that you can compare them to. So what happened to the old forms? And as you go back in time, a lot of times the modern forms don't exist in the fossils. They started to realize that layers of rocks, when you dug at them, had all sorts of little bits and pieces of living things, shells and teeth and exoskeletons and that sort of thing. And so it was recognized that you were looking at the remnants of settled sediments from some ancient body of water. Even though the sedimentary rock they were looking at wasn't underwater anymore, at one point it was underwater. And uniformitarianism, you're trying to figure out stuff from the past. Usually your easiest route in, you may need to change this eventually, but your easiest route in is to figure that what you're looking at formed in a way similar to stuff that's forming now. If it was sediment at the bottom of a body of water, then if you got a mile of sedimentary rock, which you have in the Grand Canyon, how long does it take to lay that down? Well, you can calculate how quickly sediment builds up on the bottom of a body of water, and then extrapolate that to a mile and realize you're looking at millions and millions of years. And of course, it was compressing and mineralizing And so rate that they came up with wasn't actually a legitimate rate, but it got them a way in. And they started to realize the world was really old, and you had newer layers at the top and older layers at the bottom, and as you went into the past, things were different. There were recognizable forms related to things that existed today, and then there were things that didn't exist today pretty much at all. They were related to things that existed today, like dinosaurs, that people kind of slammed into the reptile group based on a few homologies in the structures. If dinosaurs existed today, there's no way they'd be classified as reptiles, but they were. So, how does this stuff happen? How do these things change? This was a big question. It was believed that things couldn't change, that the forms that were created were perfect forms. The idea that things could go extinct was considered to be blasphemous for a while. It took a while to kind of shake that. And so you had areas that were going, no, this doesn't work this way, and areas going, not only does it work this way, but we're going to try to figure out how it works this way. And many, many people worked in this. Darwin, of course, is the famous guy, but his grandfather was trying to figure this out as well. These are questions that have been around for a really, really long time. Now, a couple of important ideas that kind of percolated out of this, that if they weren't there ahead of time, Darwin probably wouldn't have formulated his almost groundbreaking theory, where from people like Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus, who published an article. He was actually metaphorically trying to warn against too many immigrants coming into his beloved London. But he couched this in naturalistic terms and said, if you look at nature, is that population can't grow exponentially forever because it hits these natural breaks that will stabilize it or reduce it. Is that you run out of resources. Because you run out of resources, you wind up with a lot more conflict, more fighting over resources. The density of the population leads to more disease. And all of those, even though he was trying to keep the brown people out of London, all of those were legitimate observations of and extrapolations of what goes on in nature. And in fact, there's a term that we now use. For any ecosystem, pick a resident species under varied conditions. You can go perfect conditions or not so perfect conditions. How many individuals of that species can the ecosystem support essentially indefinitely? That's the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. In some cases, it's kind of like the maximum number of individuals that you can have before you run into those issues that Malthus brought up about population. Sometimes you could cheat the system. Is that organisms that go through significant metamorphosis, like mosquitoes, for instance, is that their larvae live in a different niche in the ecosystem than the adults do. So their carrying capacity is, I don't know if it's doubled, because I don't know that each ecosystem can carry the same amount of mosquito larvae versus mosquito adults, but their carrying capacity is definitely increased because at different stages of their life cycle, they are existing in different niches in the ecosystem. So, but carrying capacity is a big deal. When Darwin came along, he put his theory of natural selection out there, and then selection became a big tag word. And so this thing I'm about to write up is what we call it now. It wasn't what it was called prior to Darwin, but it's what we call it now. People had been developing changes in living things, agricultural products, plants and animals, for hundreds and hundreds of years, breeding, bigger and better cows, or cows that produce more milk, or wheat with bigger, heads on them, and corn with bigger kernels. How did they do that? Well, they separate out the individuals with the features that they're looking for, the wheat with the bigger heads. And they don't sell those, they replant those. If you're trying to get, breed a particular type of dog, you want a larger, more robust dog, then you only breed the larger individuals in your group of dogs. And what you wind up with is a group that is now different than the dogs you started with. You wind up with Airedales or Mastiffs or, Bull Terriers or Chihuahuas if you're going the other way. How do you do that? You pick and choose who gets to breed. You're selecting, but because people are doing it, nature isn't doing it, it's called artificial selection. And Darwin was, pigeons were one of his hobbies. So he was very familiar with how this worked, but everybody was familiar with how this worked. So it kind of percolated into the basic ideas. A reproduction of, the survivors was something that Darwin kind of based his theory on, but it was kind of around. Then you get LaMarck, the great goat of biology, brilliant man, very influential, which is probably why it kind of was his downfall, who the underpinnings of survival of those that are best suited for conditions, you can trace to LaMarck. The classic thing for the development of an okapi-like ancestor to what are modern-day giraffes, much taller, much longer necks. The idea that the successful giraffes were the ones that could reach the larger or the higher leaves, could kind of stretch themselves out and reach higher, get more food, be more successful, have more babies. That was embedded in LaMarck's ideas. The problem was that he, and a lot of people at the time, thought that the stretching over a lifetime and making yourself taller that way would actually result in babies that were already born taller, what they called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That I would think, although it doesn't really, well, depending on how you look at it, you might think it works this way, where an English-speaking parent might have a baby that's more adept at learning English than learning other languages. I've never seen that as an example, but you would think that would be inheritance of acquired characteristics. And of course, LaMarck was also, as many naturalists of the time were, was trying to fit this all into an idea of a world controlled by God. And if things changed over time, then it must have been part of the plan. And if people weren't in the fossil record until pretty recently, then the fossil record must have been building toward us. And being us, we're wonderful. The fossil record was a record of improvement and progress, moving toward us. That actually is an idea that's hard to get rid of. You'll see bad science fiction with an evolved form for like thousands of generations forward. Well, you can't do that. Evolution is pushed by conditions. Unless you can predict conditions for 1,000 years, you can't predict. But the way that they do it is they look at something and they kind of assume improvements in some sort of aspect of life that are going to continue and get better and better. That's all traceable to LaMarck and people of his ilk. Darwin basically kind of discarded that. So Darwin did a lot of traveling for basically to get out of the house. As a young man, roamed the world on a survey ship for the British Navy. Started to notice a relationship between the living things that he recorded and positioning and conditions. That he often would settle in an island and take notes, and then settle on the mainland nearby and take notes, and see that there were relationships between the species. If the island was really close in and the conditions were basically the same, then the mix might be a little bit different. You might not have every species on the island that you could find on the mainland, but they were basically similar without a lot of differences. If the island was nearby, but for reasons of currents and stuff, the conditions were different, the climate was different, then you'd start to see related species, but different species on the islands. And if the islands were way the heck away from the mainland, where the assumption is ancestral groups would have had a difficult time getting there, and then the mix would really be different of who could get to that island. Then you would also see differences and different species between the mainland and the islands. And in the case of the Galapagos Islands, which are 600 miles out from the equatorial Ecuador, and in a cold Antarctic current, which makes their climate extremely different from the rainforests or the coastal deserts well, coastal deserts are not that different, of Ecuador, although I think the coastal deserts are farther south in South America. The species, you could connect to species in South America, but they were very, very different. They were very well adapted to the islands that he was surveying, the Galapagos Islands. One thing I'll repeat over and over and over again, which came first, the chicken and the egg, it's a silly question. The same way that you don't breed dogs in order to get one Chihuahua. You breed dogs to get a group of dogs that will give you Chihuahuas when you keep breeding them. Is that you change the average member of a population with artificial selection, with natural selection, with sexual selection, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. I mentioned it already earlier. So the group, on average, changes. That's really what evolution is. It's a population-based process. Is that the overall mix of the population changes, so that if you take a step back and you go, so what's the average member look like here? Then that average member changes over time. It may get bigger, it may get smaller, it may get browner, it may get spikier. But you're seeing a change. Now, are there members of the population that still look more like the ancestors? Yeah. But are there members that actually look even more changed than the average member? Yeah. You're working out an average in order to get there. The idea that Darwin put forth was kind of along the lines of a used car salesman. Salesmen are taught to work a prospective customer through a series of questions that typically people would answer yes. You know, you want something safe, you want something reliable. Is that you're trying to get yes, yes, yes answers. So when you get to the important stuff is, wouldn't you like to buy this today? That they're kind of conditioned to say yes. I don't know if it really works that way, but for my very brief stint as a vacuum cleaner salesman, it didn't really work that way, but I was never terribly good at that. I do recommend, I'm not going to say it, but there is a type of vacuum cleaner that is extremely expensive compared to other vacuum cleaners. But I wound up buying one myself 40-some years ago, and I'm still using it. And it's required repairs once, and I could do it. I fixed a piece, and it's working just as well now as it worked when I bought it. So, sometimes that happens. You move up in price, to get something that you're not going to have to replace every few years. Anyway, that was really off topic. So Darwin comes in and goes, well, you know, in any group, they're not all alike, right? Yeah, there's variation in a population. Individuals crank out more offspring, whether it's seeds or babies or eggs or whatever, than are going to survive to make offspring themselves, right? Yeah. Whether you survive or not through your lifetime is largely dependent on the conditions that you have to survive in as you go through. Yeah. If conditions change, then the variations in the group that are good may be different than the old variations that were good. Is that some variations that used to be good may be bad, some ones that didn't really matter are now good, right? Yeah. So when conditions change, the potential survivors are going to be different than they were before the conditions changed, right? Yes. The conditions, nature, select the breeders the way that people select the breeders in order to change a breed. So it's basically the same process, is that the conditions change and the survivors have traits that work in the new conditions. And they often have not all the same traits that work in new conditions, and then they make babies and they mix those traits together, and eventually you wind up with an average individual that is different enough from the previous individual that it's a new species. And this often happens with terms that were brought up, a long time ago. We still use them, but the English equivalency of the words makes them confusing now. Fitness. Fitness means exactly what it sounds like. How well do you fit the new conditions? Fitness can be positive, is you have a trait that really works under the new conditions. It can be negative. Wow, this trait doesn't work anymore. You're less likely to survive with that trait. And so the idea of survival of the fittest isn't like, the fittest. It's who fits best in the current conditions. And even then it was confusing. Darwin actually didn't like the term survival of the fittest. I think he used it a grand total of once in the things he wrote. But it got very much connected because he didn't like to go out and fight with religious people and such over his ideas. He was a very non-confrontational guy. But he had people that would go out and do it. And survival of the fittest became one of those big, kind of catch buzz phrases that they used. Also, adaptations. These features that selection works on are there when you're born and going. I know we use the word adapt as something that happens kind of minute to minute to minute. It's something you do change over your lifetime. In natural selection, adaptations are features that are inbuilt and inheritable, that you can pass on, and they can be positively fit or negatively fit. And then if you start with a species in a place, sometimes there are jobs that they can do, multiple jobs. The conditions change and potential changes, and that starting population eventually winds up diverging into 2 or 3 or 4 different populations of different species. And that's considered to be adaptive radiation. Darwin found a whole bunch of birds on the Galapagos Islands that were all obviously finches, but they didn't all act like typical finches. There were several different species that had adapted to niches that were available in the islands that were either occupied on the mainland or were basically new once they got to the island. Okay, throw one more thing in here. Sometimes what's being selected for doesn't have to do with who survives to reproduce. but who reproduces most effectively. Features that help reproduction are also selected for. They're going to become more common in offspring because more offspring are going to be produced by successful reproducers. And that's called sexual selection. And that, unfortunately, is a bad term because it really should be reproductive selection. Because sexual selection can definitely occur with asexual organisms, organisms that just produce genetic copies of themselves, still can have reproductive success, still can outcompete. Is that a virus that's more effective at generating a lot of viruses and spreading them? That generation of additional viruses is a sexual selection trait. Maybe the spreading them is more of a natural selection trait. There's a lot of overlap on some of these. And sometimes natural selection will put the brake on sexual selection, right? Where there is mate selection, which is where Darwin saw this stuff, so that's where the term came from. But you think of a peacock tail. It shows females, look at me. I've been able to survive with this big old thing behind me that doesn't really do me any good except it's showy for you. I've been able to get enough food. I've been able to evade enough predators. This is where there's a limit on this. That tail can't be so big that you can't get off the ground. Peacocks do fly when threatened by a predator. And so there is a break on peacock tail size that is a natural selection break on a sexual selection trait. Okay, we'll stop there.